Nick cleared his throat and took a step forward. Excuse me. I don't mean to interrupt, but are you talking about Eric McGee of Diamonds Inc.? Everyone nodded, so he continued. Coincidentally, I had planned to go to his store and invest a little money in it. If you'll all allow it, I'd be happy to thank him on behalf of Frasier here. Oh, wow! James looked at Nick in awe. You actually know him? Earl and I are planning to get our wedding rings from him. Would you put in a good word? Well, we're not strangers, Nick smiled and winked at James. Dorothy broke into the conversation and said magnanimously, It's always best to be a gentleman. She glanced sideways at Frasier and added, Unlike some people who only know how to cause trouble and act foolishly. It's okay. I can make the call right now. Nick glanced at Frasier arrogantly. He took out his phone and made the call. Mr. McGee, hello. This is Nick Tomlins. I've been wanting to have a meeting with you for some time, but work's been piling up. You know how it goes. Oh, I understand. How can I help you? Eric McGee asked. Mr. McGee, you are too kind. I'd like to make an investment in Diamonds Inc. I'd like for us to become partners. How wonderful, Mr. Tomlins. How much are you planning to invest? I've just returned home, so it's only a small investment for now. How does $1 million sound? Dorothy and her son exchanged surprised and envious glances. If Nick considered $1 million a small investment, he truly was worthy of his reputation. He was rich, capable, and talented. Dorothy sighed as she thought dreamily. Oh, if only Natalia had married Nick, where would we all be now? The topic of conversation finally fell onto Frasier. Mr. McGee, I heard that you gave away a dark blue necklace to someone. Did his name happen to be Frasier? Now that Nick had made a business deal, his attitude and tone had grown less polite. How do you know about that? Eric asked suspiciously. He remembered the incident vividly, but he had promised to keep it a secret. Frasier's capabilities were not something he could speak of carelessly. To tell you the truth, Frasier is a friend of mine, Nick said. He gave the necklace to someone very important to me, so I want to know more about it. Nick was confident that now that he had invested so much in McGee's company, he would be willing to share information with him. However, there was a clear pause on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, Mr. Tomlins. There really isn't anything I can tell you about that matter. Everything was above the table, but I'm unable to offer any more information. Eric was grateful for Nick's investment in his business, but he also knew where his allegiances should lie after Frasier had given him much more money for a single necklace. The atmosphere was awkward. Nick had put his phone on speakerphone so everyone could hear what was being said. He thought his openness would gain him more respect in the eyes of the Laplace family. Houstus put down his newspaper. He couldn't believe his ears. As he looked at Dorothy and James, he could see they felt the same. Eric McGee obviously didn't know how to behave when it came to favors. He was rapidly going down in everyone's estimation with his refusal to reveal such a trivial matter. After all, he was nothing more than a man who sold jewelry. Nick was embarrassed. He glanced at Natalia. She looked puzzled. He cleared his throat before he spoke. Eric, you have to think this through, he said, aware that everyone's eyes were on him. I'm only asking you for something small. He paused, as if he was making a decision. Would it help if I offered you some more money? Think of the original sum as a down payment, he said. He knew that if he could find that sort of money, he would reap his investment tenfold in the future. Eric knew this too, but he still refused. I'm sorry, Mr. Tomlins. Even if you paid me 10 times that amount, I won't change my mind. I promise you it will be worth your while, said Nick. I really want to help you, said Eric, but I can't. I'm sorry. I have things to do now. See you around." He hung up, leaving everyone staring at the now silent phone. Frasier smiled. The man's got more integrity than I gave him credit for, he thought. At least I haven't been exposed. Yet. But then something else occurred to him. If Eric McGee didn't want the money, he obviously isn't worried about expanding his business anytime soon, he thought. Nick ran his hands through his hair. He was very embarrassed. "He obviously doesn't know the value of a favor," said James, patting him on the shoulder. "I understand that he wants to protect the privacy of his customers, but don't worry. It's just a necklace. I'm sure it's not worth that much." Nick looked at the necklace again. The more he looked at it, the more he felt that it was no ordinary jewelry item. He stood up as his frustration rose. "Dorothy, I've got to go," he said. "I'll have to join you all for dinner another day." He left before anyone could answer him, jumping into his luxurious sports car and driving off. Dorothy watched in despair as he left. It was another missed opportunity for Natalia as far as she was concerned. She turned around, only to find Frasier standing behind her. In frustration, she slapped him. "Look at what you've done," she shouted angrily. "It was good of him to make a trip to our house, but you and that Eric McGee spoiled it." "Mom!" shouted Natalia. She was happy that Nick had left, but not when she realized her mother felt completely different. "No, Natalia, he deserved it," said James. "Your husband was a fool for giving you this cheap necklace. I'm gonna put it in the trash for you to save you the effort of doing it yourself." He reached out his hand to take it, but she quickly pulled it to her chest as if it was a valuable treasure. "No," she replied, running her hand nervously through her hair. "It's a pity to throw it away. I'll find a pawn shop and exchange it for money." "Well, make sure you get a reasonable price for it," he said sullenly. He didn't dare touch the necklace again. He knew his sister's fiery temperament too well. Natalia put the necklace back down on the table and examined it closely. She knew she should take her brother's advice and just throw it away, but something about it intrigued her. She wasn't sure if it was because it was the first necklace Frasier had bought her, or because it was one of the very few gifts he had given her. Maybe it's because it's a symbol of us making up after another argument, she thought. Natalia shook her head in frustration, trying to get all the ideas out of her mind. Of course, it wasn't because of any of those reasons, because even though the necklace wasn't worth much, it was truly pretty, and she liked it. She picked it up and took it to her room, closing the door gently behind her. Nick sped along the city streets in his fancy car, desperate to get home so that he could think. The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. He clearly had the advantage, but somehow, at the last minute, something had gone wrong. He was not in the mood to find Eric McGee, but he did have a burning desire to get even with him. But that was something he would do another day. His phone vibrated, snapping him out of his reverie. He pulled over so he could see who was calling him. Once he had stopped, he answered the call. "I've done what you asked me to do," said a voice at the other end of the line. "I've arranged for you to meet Brett Andrews." He smiled. He almost forgot that he still hadn't fulfilled his promise to Natalia. He still hadn't purchased the company to give it to her. Besides, it was something much more helpful and valuable than a piece of jewelry. As for Frasier, he was nothing better than an earthworm. He was spineless. After being humiliated to the point where he had no dignity left, he hadn't made a single sound. How could he possibly get revenge on him? He pulled away from the curb and accelerated away from the surrounding traffic. He couldn't wait for his meeting with Brett Andrews. The next morning, Brett arrived at his office early. He had a meeting with an imperative customer, and he wanted to be well prepared. Now that he knew what to prepare, he didn't know why the man was coming to see him. His personal assistant had told him that the person on the other end of the phone had been quite vague. All she knew was that he had just returned to San Clemente after a period abroad, where he had great success. At 10 o'clock precisely, his personal assistant knocked on his door and introduced him to a well-dressed young man. His name was Nick Tomlins. "Hello, Mr. Andrews," he said politely. "Please, call me Brett," he replied. "Take a seat. Would you like some coffee?" The two men quickly appraised each other and liked what they saw. They began chatting enthusiastically while they waited for their coffee to arrive. "I hear you had a successful time while you were abroad," said Brett. "Is it true you managed to open up a market in China? I'm surprised you decided to come back to the States." "I grew up here," said Nick. "My family and friends still live here, as well as someone I can't forget." "That explains why you chose to come here and not go to one of the big cities," Brett replied. "I would have thought a man of your caliber would have gone straight to Washington or Chicago." "Yes," agreed Nick. "I did think about it, but I'd heard that San Clemente is becoming quite a desirable place to live these days, so I decided to come back here and help build its reputation as an up-and-coming city." Brett was beginning to fall for the trap. Nick was a hot-blooded capitalist and a man after his own heart. Brett was urged to join forces and work on some big projects together. "So, how can I help you?" he asked. "I presume that's why you're here. My company's new, but hopefully I can be of some assistance to you." Nick looked at him. Brett was bold, with piercingly blue eyes. He liked what he saw. "I think we're destined to be friends," he said. Brett smiled. He loved making friends, especially with men like Frasier or Nick. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. "What did you have in mind?" "It's very simple," said Nick. "I understand that you own 2 companies. Tell me the small one, and then you can focus on managing the larger one." Brett frowned. It was not the kind of cooperation he had in mind. Quick to notice Brett's discomfort, Nick continued. "Don't worry. I'll make it worth your while," he said. "Not only will I buy the smaller company, but I'd also like to make a substantial investment in Frandotech." "How substantial?" asked Brett. Nick wrote a number down on a piece of paper and handed it to Brett. As he read the number, his eyes opened so wide they nearly fell out of his head. "Of course," added Nick, "I'd also promote your company with several of my larger clients, many of whom you may have heard of." Brett was no longer listening. This man is dancing with death, he thought. "Excuse me," interrupted Brett, before Nick could continue with his smooth advertising offering. "Would you mind if I just went and made a call?" He picked up his cell phone and pointed at it. "Of course," answered Nick. "Go ahead." Puzzled, he watched Brett leave the room. It seemed strange to him that a man who ran his own company would leave the room in the middle of a meeting to make a call. It felt as if he was running off to tell a higher authority about what was going on and get permission to continue. "The man is too soft," thought Nick. "Just like Frasier. But at least he's running his own company, unlike Frasier, who had to marry in order to get anywhere in life." Not that he cared. As long as he won control of the Heavenbreakers gang, getting hold of Brett's company would be easy. The first thing he would do with the company would be to make Natalia his personal assistant. He smiled, wondering just how personal she would be with him. Brett's smile vanished as soon as he had closed his door behind him. He went to a small room further down the corridor and dialed a number. Frasier answered, not giving him a chance to speak. "Has Hugh Styles made any moves yet?" he asked. Frasier hadn't gone into the office that morning. Instead, he returned to Diamonds Inc. to meet the manager, Eric McGee. Eric had been very excited to see him, remembering Frasier's recent visit where he had bought the Heart of the Seas necklace for his wife. Frasier had paid him a huge amount of money to thank him for keeping quiet when Nick had pressed him for information the day before. "No," replied Brett, "but you should come to the office as soon as you can. Someone wants to buy the company." Frasier didn't answer him straight away. He was trying to recall exactly what Nick had said the day before when he went to pick up Natalia. He had mentioned buying the company from Brett, but Frasier hadn't expected him to move quite so quickly. "Let me guess. Is his name Nick Tomlins?" asked Frasier. "How did you know?" asked Brett. Not that he was surprised. Frasier was always one step ahead of everyone he knew. Frasier chuckled. "I can't leave right now," he said. "Refuse his offer or drag it out for as long as you can. I'll get there when I can." With that, he hung up. Putting his phone in his pocket, Frasier smiled and turned back to Eric. "Now, where were we?" he asked. "Frasier, I heard you talking about Nick Tomlins on the phone just now," he said. "Is it the same Nick Tomlins as the one I know?" "One and the same," said Frasier brightly. "He called you yesterday. I was right by him when he did." Eric felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if he had just brushed shoulders with the gods of death. Nick must have seen the necklace the day before and wanted to find out more about it from him to mock Frasier. Had he told Nick anything, he wouldn't have lived to see the end of the day. As he looked at Frasier, he resolved to be even more discreet. Even if he had to cut off his own tongue, he would never reveal even half a word in the future. Brett looked at his phone in annoyance. He found it frustrating that Frasier left him with all the mundane duties of running a company while he ran around doing what felt to him like nothing. Even though a man he hated was trying to buy their company, he didn't seem to care. As he walked back to his office, he tried to work out what Frasier wanted him to do. He didn't know whether to chase the man out of his office and tell him never to darken his door again, or keep him talking in case Frasier had a plan. He decided to drag it out for a little longer. "I'm sorry about that," he said, forcing a smile as he walked back through his office door. "No problem," said Nick smoothly. He smiled in a way he thought would make Brett warm to him. "May I ask who you were calling? If it's one of my contacts, perhaps I may be able to help you." "It was an important customer," lied Brett. "He's trying to use his wealth to take control of my company, and to be honest, he's becoming more than a little annoying. I'm tempted to pay him a large sum of money just to get him off my hands." Nick looked at him, a little unsure if his comments were actually aimed at him. He tensed. "Anyway, where were we?" asked Brett brightly. "That's right. We were talking about cooperating. Tell me more, I'm very interested." Nick relaxed. Perhaps Brett wasn't talking about him after all. But surely he must have known I would have thought that, he thought. Unless Brett is as keen on Natalia as the rumors had me believe. Maybe Brett and I could be friends after all. Nick smiled. As he repeated the plan he had in his mind, Brett pretended to listen seriously, nodding at regular intervals. When Nick finished, Brett slammed the table in delight. "I love it!" he shouted, making his assistant jump as she came in with a letter for him to sign. "I'm glad you like it," said Nick. "I'm giving you the opportunity to tap into a pool of resources you otherwise wouldn't be able to afford." Brett realized that he had lost his composure. He took a few deep breaths and smoothed down his suit. "Yeah, it all seems a bit too good to be true, though," he added, pretending to look worried. "You can trust me," said Nick, looking him straight in the eye. "I'm almost ashamed you're showing me so much kindness," said Brett. Nick coughed. "It's not a gift," he said. "We'll follow the correct procedures and make sure that money does change hands." "Of course," said Brett. "You are honest and straightforward. I like you. Let's get our teams together and we'll draw up all the necessary documents." He stood up and patted his shoulder. Nick stood up too. "One of these days, I'll be thanking you for all the help you've offered," he said, trying his best to sound humble. They shook hands and Brett asked his personal assistant to accompany Nick to his car. As soon as the office door had closed behind him, Brett picked up his phone and called Frasier again, who answered after the first ring. "Frasier, you have to get rid of this man," he said. "If you make me talk to him alone again, I think I'll be sick." "Don't worry. He's got his sights set on my wife. Frasier said in a cold tone. He'll not get away with that. He didn't care how Nick had made his fortune. What he did care about was that for as long as the man had intentions on Frasier's wife, he would personally destroy him. Nick did not attempt to contact Natalia for several days, leaving her in peace at work and at home. Natalia missed traveling in his luxury car. Do you have to pick me up for work in this rust bucket? She asked Frasier one evening, thinking about how nice it would be to drive home in Nick's car with the roof down. Frasier said nothing. He pulled away from the curb and into the rush hour traffic, wondering how a fancier car would get her home any quicker in the rush hour than his car. They drove home to find Dorothy waiting for them. She didn't look happy.
Hey guys, Frasier here. Listen to the full episode of Unraveling the Son-In-Law exclusively on Pocket FM app. Click the link in description to install the app now.